Mark, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're so happy to have you here with us today. And we're going to ask if you want to make just a few opening comments on some of the most important and pressing points that you'd like to make about Russia, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me. The Russian Federation, as the country is formally known, is a country that has existed for 32 years, not quite 32 years, 31 and a half years. And it emerged out of the disintegrating Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had existed since 1917. It had been an extremely repressive dictatorship, especially during the years under Joseph Stalin. But then starting in 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in Moscow and gradually embarked on a program of sweeping political reform that by the end of the 1980s and in the first couple of years of the 1990s resulted in substantial liberalization and democratization of the whole Soviet Union. But what that did, the Soviet Union consisted of 15 republics, of which the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, as it was known, was by far the largest. It was about 76% of the Soviet territory and over half the population. And the Soviet Union was by far the world's largest country. It was about 1/6 of the world's landmass, so an enormous country, more than double the size of the United States in territory. But the liberalization and democratization that occurred in the Soviet Union, it was such a fundamental change in a country that had been a totalitarian dictatorship, that it resulted in pressures for the individual republics to break away. And that came to a head in 1991 with there was an attempted coup by hardliners in Moscow in August 1991, and it failed. And so in the next 4 months, there were several republics that left. But then importantly, on the 1st of December 1991, there was a referendum in Ukraine that resulted overwhelmingly in a bid for independence. So at that point, the Russian government, which was headed by Boris Yeltsin, which had initially wanted to keep together a Slavic union with Ukraine and Belarus. But as Ukraine was moving for independence, Russia took the lead in pushing for the breakup of the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union disintegrated on the 26th of December 1991, the Russian, what became the Russian Federation, was an independent country for the first time. The Russian Federation then adopted a constitution in December of 1993, but that constitution was one that had been adopted under certain political circumstances that made it a much more centralized constitution, and particularly centralizing power in a presidency. There is a parliament in Russia, but that parliament under the constitution had quite inferior powers. It was, however, throughout the 1990s, the Russian parliament played an important role. It did impose quite significant constraints on Yeltsin as president. It was able to block certain steps he wanted to take. It was also able to force certain things to be done. All of that changed when Vladimir Putin came to power at the end of 1999. Yeltsin unexpectedly stepped down as president and transferred power. So power did not change hands through a free and fair election. It changed hands through a rigged transfer of power. And Putin has been the dominant leader in Russia ever since. In other words, for 23 years now, he has led Russia. And during that time, he undid, Russia was never a democracy. It wasn't even close, but it was moving in the early 1990s in a generally democratizing direction. But the constitution that was adopted was clearly one that was not conducive to further democratization. In fact, throughout the 1990s, from late 1993 on, Russia began having real problems with democratic reform. And once Putin came to office at the very last day of 1999, he basically systematically set about dismantling even the limited gains that had been made. So Russia over the last 23 years has had an increasingly personalistic dictatorship. And I emphasize that it is personalistic because from May 2008 to May 2012, Putin was not president. He had stepped down temporarily to serve as prime minister, which under the Russian constitution is not as powerful an office as the president. He had temporarily left the presidency to be filled by a crony of his, Dmitry Medvedev. And nonetheless, it was very clear that Medvedev was not the top leader in Russia during that time. It continued to be Putin. So Putin has not only consolidated his own power around his personality, he's also systematically dismantled any hint of political opposition in Russia. He has cracked down on any freedom of speech. There are draconian laws adopted last year that prohibit any dissent from the current war of aggression that Russia launched against Ukraine. But even before that, there had been severe curtailment of civil liberties, a crackdown on any political protest, on any political opposition. The Russian parliament was subordinated to Putin's own ends. So basically, Russia at this point is back to being a dictatorship, but it's a dictatorship that is no longer under a single party as it was in communist times, but instead is a personalistic dictatorship revolving around Vladimir Putin. And that's the type of country that it can be very difficult to live with for its smaller neighbors, as Ukraine has found out most recently, but other neighbors, Georgia, the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, Moldova, another former Soviet republic, and Tajikistan. So there are numerous republics that have had Russian troops intervene in them and still have Russian troops present in them against their will. So Ukraine is only the latest victim of that.
Well, thank you. That is a great overview. And I think we're going to jump to questions. And Janine, would you like to weigh in with a few questions?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Kramer. That was really very informative. I appreciate it so much. I actually, my father was in the Air Force during the Cold War. So I'm very familiar with, and I've actually sort of been to have my own little degree in Russian history with all the Russian reading I've done and the Dostoevsky I've read, and which is a whole nother time period. But all the beautiful Russian music and Solzhenitsyn, or whatever, all the Russian history. I'm very familiar with the horrors of communism and what happened, and so many things are going through my mind. Putin is upset. You mentioned that around 92, 93, I guess Gorbachev, was he still in then?
No, he resigned all his offices on Christmas Day, 1991. He had been general secretary of the Communist Party until August of 1991. After the failed coup in August 1991, the Communist Party was disbanded by an executive decree of Yeltsin. So from that point on, Gorbachev's main office was the Soviet president. There had been a presidency created in March 1990, and Gorbachev had held that office. And on Christmas Day 1991, realizing that the Soviet Union was being dissolved, he resigned from that office. And from then on, Yeltsin was unchallenged as the leader of Russia.
Now, why did Gorbachev resign? Because the Soviet Union was being dissolved? Wasn't he a part of the
He was
process?
The leader of the Soviet Union, so he was soon going to be leader of a country that no longer existed. Both,
but he wanted that. Didn't he want that? With
no, quite the opposite.
No, really? He's always painted as the hero of Reagan and Gorbachev having the meetings and I mean, you're the one who knows. So I'm just saying. My opinion,
Gorbachev achieved remarkable things while he was in office, but one of his goals was to preserve the Soviet Union, and but in a much different form. He wanted it to be a politically liberalized state that would have elections and the sorts of things that existed in the Soviet Union.
So we're saying the same thing. It's just that he didn't want the actual, say, unity of states. In other words, the actual country to dissolve into the satellites when Ukraine and everybody pulled away. But he did want a more liberalized government, right?
After the August 1991 coup, power shifted very strikingly toward Yeltsin. See, both the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, as it was known in Soviet times, the Russian Republic, and the Soviet Union both had their capitals in Moscow. So there were overlapping centers of authority for several months in 1991. And Yeltsin was competing with Gorbachev and basically wanted to replace Gorbachev. He probably would have been willing to leave Gorbachev as a figurehead, but he wanted to replace him as the real center of power in what he hoped. Yeltsin too did not initially want to break up the larger state. He wanted to keep a Slavic union with Ukraine and Belarus. He was not especially enthusiastic about keeping the Central Asian republics, of which there were several in the Soviet Union, and then there were the smaller republics that did break away in August of 1991, right after the coup. That would include the former Republic of Georgia, Moldova, a small republic joining Romania, and then Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the very small Baltic.
But Yeltsin, Gorbachev did want a liberal, more democracy within the Soviet Union, but Yeltsin did not. What did Yeltsin want?
No, Yeltsin did, in fact. He had initially been seen as a bolder reformer than Gorbachev, but in the end, what both Yeltsin and Gorbachev came down to in the final months of 1991 was a struggle for power. Which one would control the main levers of power in what was a very rapidly changing country. So what both of them had to face, though, in December of 1991 was that the Soviet Union was going to disintegrate. So Yeltsin faced up to that by pushing for the dissolution and having Russia emerge as by far the largest component of the Soviet Union, whereas Gorbachev at that point had lost every lever that he had any longer. He no longer had any means of keeping the Soviet Union together.
Interesting. Okay, this is fascinating to clarify all this. Well, then this is what Putin's upset about, though, correct? He did not like it that the Soviet Union dissolved into all these satellite countries and states and whatnot, like Ukraine becoming its own independent country.
Yeah, but
This is why Putin is upset about that, right? And that's why
that's
he's
one
attacked.
of the things he's upset about, but
Uh-huh.
in particular about Ukraine. He gave a speech to the Russian, this is Putin, gave a speech to the Russian parliament in April of 2005. So this was 5 years or so after he had come to office. And he, in that speech, described the breakup of the Soviet Union as, and I'm quoting him here, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Now, if you bear in mind, that's a direct quotation from his speech. The breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Now, if you bear in mind that the 20th century had the First World War, which killed about 17 million people, the Second World War, which killed 70 or 75 million people, including the genocide of the Holocaust. If you bear in mind that the 20th century also had many, many other highly destructive wars, it had genocide in Rwanda, that it is quite remarkable that he would single out the breakup of the Soviet Union, which was mostly peaceful. There was no one killed in Moscow during the breakup of the Soviet Union. So if he singles that out as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, it does tell you something about his outlook.
Why did Yeltsin, if he was really for more reforms and a more seemingly open society with more democracy and liberalism like Gorbachev wanted, why did he just hand it over to Putin?
That's a very good question. Yeltsin was in failing health at that point. He wasn't all that old, but he was at that point approaching 70 years old, and he had major problems with alcohol. He had heart surgery a few years earlier, and he had numerous other ailments that caused him to begin thinking in 1998 and then into 1999 about stepping down. So he was looking around for a successor, and ultimately he settled on Putin for reasons that Yeltsin did describe in memoirs that he wrote, but are not terribly convincing. So it remains a bit of a mystery why he chose Putin, but certainly one key factor was that Putin had in the late summer and fall of 1999, while Yeltsin was still president, Putin had been appointed prime minister by Yeltsin. That was an appointed office at that point, wasn't elected. And in that capacity, Putin embarked on a brutal counterinsurgency war in Chechnya. This was the second war that the Russian Federation fought in Chechnya. Chechnya is a small republic on the southern rim of Russia in a very mountainous region in Russia's southwest. And it had pressed for independence in the early 1990s. There was a war fought from December 1994 through August 1996, and the Russian federal forces had basically been forced out of Chechnya. It was a humiliating setback for the Russian government. And so when Putin came in 1999, Chechen insurgents had launched raids into Russia, and in response to that, the Russian government, Yeltsin had authorized Putin to embark on a counterinsurgency war that had made Putin the most popular figure in Russia at that point. So that undoubtedly played some role in Yeltsin's decision to transfer power.
Interesting. Okay, I want to make sure I toss this over to Tova, but before I do, I have two more sort of lightning round questions. One is about their constitution, and another is about the danger that Russia poses for us today. And but the Constitution first. Do they have a Bill of Rights? Do they have a First Amendment, freedom of religion, assembly, press, petition, speech?
it's a good question. Most of the the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, the so-called Bill of Rights, most of those guarantees are embodied in some form in the Russian Constitution, but not as a separate Bill of Rights, but just at various points. However, the Russian Constitution has to be seen in the context of Russian politics. The Constitution is as good as what a country makes of it. The Soviet Union had a constitution that contained similar guarantees of rights, yet were never observed in practice. The Soviet Union was a extremely repressive dictatorship. So a constitution on its own doesn't mean all that much if a country, a government, a population are not going to press for the rights in it to be observed. And in the United States, over the course of 230, 240 years, has through the Supreme Court, but also through elections and through political processes, has solidified its constitutional rights. There continue to be debates about where they are. There are debates about whether freedom of speech, for example, should include such things as the burning of the flag, which the Supreme Court ruled in 1988, in fact, should be included as a speech act covered by the First Amendment, and other such things. There are limits on certain rights, and those are established in the United States through Supreme Court decisions and through political practice. Whereas in Russia, which has had a much more recent constitution, a constitution that will turn 30 years old this December, there never has been any real attempt to uphold the most basic rights. So Putin in 2020, got numerous amendments to the Constitution passed that basically allow him to stay in office until at least 2036. By 2036, he will be 84 years old. And, in other words, for another 13 years at this point, that he will be able to stay in office. So it is
interesting. Okay.
It is a constitution that has numerous limits on any attempt to uphold democratic rights. One last thing on that too is there were draconian laws passed in March 2022 on the 5th of March, about 10 days after the invasion of Ukraine began, that severely restrict what can be said and what can be written in Russia. So any leeway there had been for freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of protest in Russia has basically disappeared at that point, regardless of what the Constitution says.
Yeah, that's really, we at Constitute America, we speak to a lot of students, and in every class, I emphasize this, how lucky we are in this country that we still have these freedoms, and to not take them for granted, because 1 billion plus people around the world do not have these freedoms. Very last question, 30-second answer, and I want to toss to Tova. In their Constitution, when the president or the whatever they're called, prime minister, when Putin is sworn into office, he's there forever. But does the Constitution stipulate that the leader pledge allegiance to the people or allegiance to the Constitution? Because in America, of course, our president swears to protect and preserve and defend the Constitution and not serve the people, because the Constitution protects the people. I'm just curious, in their Constitution, if the leader is sworn to protect the Constitution or the people.
Well, in principle, the president, because there is also a prime minister in Russia, the prime minister is subordinate to the president under the Constitution. That was not the case, however, when Putin served for 4 years as prime minister. He was clearly the dominant leader in Russia. So the splitting into two offices complicates it somewhat, but both are sworn to uphold the Constitution, but
Oh, they
also
are.
to pledge chief loyalty to the Russian Federation. The Russia is a federation. It has 89 federal subjects, but it's mostly a federation at this point in name only. It had been a real federation during the Yeltsin years, where individual components of Russia, which again is a vast country, that it is spanning 11 time zones and again almost double the size of the United States in territory. So the federal subjects did have considerable leeway in the 1990s. All of that's gone now. So the Russian Federation is in principle the chief pledge of loyalty on the part of both the president and the prime minister in Russia is there, and to the Constitution. But
and everyone's scared to death to vote against him, I'm sure.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Okay,
Russia right now is a
yeah.
personalistic dictatorship in which
Yeah.
the chief loyalty of everyone else is to Putin. There have been, for example, there have been federal ministers in Russia who have used the same phrase that was used in Nazi Germany about Hitler ist Party, Party ist Deutschland, Deutschland ist Hitler. That the party is Hitler, Hitler is the party, Germany is therefore Hitler. So that same phrase in slightly altered form has been used in Russia nowadays, is that Russia is Putin. It's a very disturbing type of rhetoric.
Yeah, that's very frightening. Very frightening. Okay, thank you, Mr. Kramer. I'm going to toss to Tova now. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been an amazing overview. And I wanted to focus a bit on Putin himself, as you've mentioned, since Russia is a personalist dictatorship, as you classified it. So could you talk about how Putin himself, how his style of leadership compares to previous Soviet leaders, and what sort of is his ideology politically? And then how has he been able to amass so much power? Who is his main opposition? Just give an overview of his leadership.
Okay, I'll do that as concisely as I can. First of all, Putin was never a leader in Soviet times, so he has been only a Russian leader. During Soviet times, he was born in 1952, in September of 1952, and grew up as a very loyal Soviet citizen. He joined the KGB, which is not the type of organization that democracy-minded individuals in the Soviet Union joined. It was a repressive secret police organization. He joined the internal security apparatus of it in the mid-1970s, served for 11 years in the internal security apparatus. And for the last 5 years of his career in the KGB, he served it. There was the KGB, unlike in the United States, where foreign intelligence is separate. For the FBI is handles internal criminal matters and counter-espionage, whereas the foreign intelligence in the United States is handled primarily by the CIA, and then also by the National Security Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency. In the Soviet Union, the KGB handled both, so it had a foreign intelligence directorate, and Putin served his final 5 years there. So that's where he was toward the end of the Soviet era in the KGB. He was stationed in his final few years in East Germany, which of course communism collapsed in East Germany while Putin was there. And he observed that, and that was part of what he deeply regretted. He had been a committed servant and champion of Soviet-style dictatorship. So as the Soviet Union was breaking apart, Putin had moved to his native city, which was Leningrad, now renamed in 1991 as St. Petersburg, as it's known now. And he made his career in the 1990s initially in St. Petersburg, But then in the mid-90s, he was able to establish ties with Yeltsin's government and moved into power. So Putin did not have any real experience at the time that he came into power in 1999. He had been head of the Federal Security Service in 1998 and into 1999. The Federal Security Service is essentially the renamed KGB. The KGB was never dissolved. It was simply renamed. And unlike in most other former communist states where they did dismantle the secret police, in Russia it continued to exist. So Putin's instincts are very much those of a former KGB officer, and certainly not someone who has in mind the promotion of human rights and democracy. He inherited a system from Yeltsin, the only other Russian leader there has been. He inherited a system that was conducive to the consolidation of strength within the presidency, but he also converted it into a personalistic dictatorship, something that Yeltsin had never, wouldn't have been capable of doing. Putin was able to do it because he benefited from a rise in global oil prices and other fluke circumstances that contributed to an economic revival in Russia, starting at the very end of the Yeltsin period and continuing into Putin's first several years. So many Russians associated Putin with economic improvements, and that gave him a good deal of political capital that he's been able to use ever since. The Russian economy over the last 9 years or so has, or even further before that, the last decade has really not done well. It has grown slightly, but very little, not enough to keep up with inflation. So that issue is no longer the basis of Putin's popularity in Russia, but instead it's simply that many Russians have known no alternative. Anyone in Russia under 30 nowadays has never known anyone other than Putin to lead the country.
I see. And then in a similar vein, could you speak to what his popularity is within Russia? And then also on our previous chat last week, we had an expert on about North Korea, and she was talking about how there is a very almost total lack of civil society in North Korea, which makes it difficult for dissent to rise. So looking to Russia, how vibrant is the civil society, and outside of the government, what avenues are there for people to get together and form associations?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Russia is definitely not North Korea. It is nowhere near as repressive as North Korea, and probably never will be, because too much water has passed under the bridge in Russia, going back to the late 1980s and early 1990s, but particularly with the rise of the internet. Russia does have control over a lot of internet sites, but it does not have the same expansive control that, say, China has, or Cuba, or Iran, and certainly nowhere near as much control as North Korea, because in North Korea, the use of the internet is banned. So so that's one alternative source of information that Russians are able to gain, even though it's risky for Russians to use it. If they say certain things online, they potentially can be prosecuted, especially if it's opposition to the war. But in addition, Russians are able to travel, well, they were at least until the war began, able to travel freely abroad, which was not something that Soviet citizens could do until the very end of the Gorbachev period. And then, so there are ways in which Russia has contacts with the outside world that North Koreans do not, and never have. So Russia isn't as repressive by any means, and there was a very active civil society in Russia in the early the late 80s and into the early 90s, but it basically gradually faded in the 1990s. It was enough, however. The civil society played a big role in expressing opposition to the first war in Chechnya, the one from 1994 to 96. And it's one of the reasons that the Russian government had to pull out there. But Putin learned that lesson, and he wanted to ensure that there would be no vibrant civil society to oppose his war in Chechnya, which began in the late summer of 1999 and continued into 2009. And it did reestablish Chechnya very firmly as a part of the Russian Federation. So the civil society was one of Putin's targets to weaken, and he did weaken it a great deal. There is not a vibrant civil society. There is still a civil society in Russia, but it during the war has been almost completely neutered, and the prospects for reviving it are probably going to have to wait until Putin is gone from the scene.
Wow, that's fascinating to hear, and yeah, great to compare it to the other countries we've examined in this series. And then I want to ask a bit of a broader question about the demographics of Russia. So obviously, Russia is a massive country geographically, and it's also very diverse with over 190 ethnic groups. And then interestingly, I was looking into the demographics of the fertility rate, and it's only 1.5, well below the replacement rate of 2.1 children per family. And the population is much older compared to a lot of other countries. So how do these demographics sort of play into how the government has to rule itself, and what different interests Putin has to keep in mind as he's ruling?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, during the 1990s and well into the 2000s, the Russian population was shrinking. Some of that was emigration, but a lot of it had to do with precisely what you mentioned, the low fertility rate and the high mortality rate. Russia continues to have a high mortality rate. And fertility rate for a while had gone up about 10 to 12 years ago. It had gone up, and the Russian population briefly expanded for a couple of years, but it has been shrinking again in recent years, including over the past 15 months. Close to 1 million Russians have left, either in opposition to the war, or the much more numerous numbers would be those who are trying to avoid mobilization, about conscription. So many of those who have left Russia are not opposed to the war. They simply don't want to fight it. So the young people, because it's been overwhelmingly young people, many in the IT industry in Russia, who have left over the last year. And that has done considerable economic damage to Russia. Demographically, the trends are definitely unfavorable for Russia. The population, as you noted, is relatively old, but even by European standards, the Russia, because of its immense size, is a sparsely populated country. The population density is vastly lower than in the United States. Russia's population is about 145 million, which is about 45% of the US population, and Russia is almost twice the size. So it is a very sparsely populated country. Most of the largest cities in Russia are larger than the two largest US cities. In the United States, it would be New York and Los Angeles. The two largest Russian cities, Moscow is larger than New York City, and St. Petersburg is larger than Los Angeles. Moscow is about 12 million, potentially even with some illegal migrants in Moscow, about 15 million. St. Petersburg is about 5.5 million, potentially 7 million with illegal migrants. Many of those illegal migrants are from other former Soviet republics, and a lot of them work illegally in the underground economy. So the population of Russia is very differently shaped from, say, the way the US population is, which is fairly evenly distributed. It's heavily along US urban areas along the two coasts of the United States, and a much more sparsely populated heartland. But in Russia, that's far more the case, that there are large swaths of Russia that have almost no population in them. So demographically, it is a somewhat troubled country, because in areas where pensioners need to be supported, the pension system in Russia is entirely state pensions. There is no private pension system the way many US workers have, but they have Social Security, but they also have private pensions that they're able to fall back on. In Russia, it's entirely state-funded pension systems. And so that means that as the labor force shrinks in Russia, that there are far fewer people who can contribute to fund a pension system.
Wow. Yeah, thank you. That was a fascinating overview and lots of interesting questions to observe in the future. I really want to pass on to Jewel and Jorn, but I couldn't hold myself back from asking one question. Reading your biography, talking about your work with the newly opened archives in the former Warsaw Pact countries. Could you just provide like a very short overview of your work on that, and if there's any fascinating insights that you've been able to pull so far in your work?
Well, the last question you asked would probably take me, several hours to respond to. But yes, I began in 1992. Actually, as soon as the Soviet Union broke up, a colleague of mine in Washington, D.C. convinced me. He was at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and he convinced me that it would be worthwhile to try to work in the archives of former communist countries, including in the former Soviet Union. But I also went and worked in the archives in the former East Germany, in Poland, in former Czechoslovakia, both the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and then here in Bulgaria, where I am now, in Romania, Albania, so all of the former Warsaw Pact countries. But in Moscow, because Moscow was such a Soviet Union played such a key role in the Warsaw Pact, and Moscow was the capital, the most important Warsaw Pact materials, and especially about Soviet history, are in Moscow. So until I was in Moscow as recently as the 9th of February of 2022, about 2 weeks before the war began. And, archival access was actually excellent. So it's contrary to what you would expect, as the political situation in Russia got worse and worse. The archival situation was actually very good. Access had improved a great deal compared even to the 1990s. Working conditions were excellent. So it definitely was not the case that archival research was closing down, at least before this war began. It was the opposite. You could actually benefit a great deal. And let me add just one point on this. By contrast, in China, which remains a communist dictatorship, in China, there was briefly a period in which you could work not in the central Communist Party archives, but in some of the regional archives, and also the Foreign Ministry archive was open for a while from 2004 through 2012, 2013. But once Xi Jinping came to office in 2012, basically archival access began closing. So in China now, it is pretty much pointless to try to work in archives, whereas the trend in Russia was the opposite, that even as the political situation was deteriorating and was becoming more and more authoritarian, the archival situation was one of highly professional operation of the archive. So, I value democracy in Russia, but I also value the quality of the archives. And so at least one of those criteria were fulfilled even during the Putin years.
Well, thank you so much. And I'll now pass on to Jewel and Jordan. My apologies for consuming some of your question time with my curiosity, but thank you so much for being here.
Definitely one of the most informative shows we've had. I didn't know, I don't know Russian history well, particularly the more modern history. So I've often wondered, and I'm sure our viewers have wondered, how things have become how they have. So that was just great to hear. My one kind of super question would be, you spoke of the Soviet Union, and you spoke of the long title that they gave the Federation name, and then modern Russia. What is the Russian identity? What is the Russian identity, and why does it drive them to want to bring in these countries as well and expand it, rather than build up their own, what we are now calling Russia?
Yeah, excellent question. Russia is this immense landmass. There are a few barriers, geographic barriers, particularly the Ural Mountains, which are well east of Moscow, or near another large city in Russia called Ekaterinburg, which used to be called Sverdlovsk. And but aside from those mountains and a few other natural barriers, it's just this immense space that has no real geographic end to it. And so as a result, this Eurasian landmass, as it's known, has been conducive to repeated expansion. And Russians often talk about being invaded, as they were by Napoleon, in 1812, and by the German army during the First World War, and then and especially the Second World War. But you don't get to be by far the world's largest country just by being invaded. You do a great deal of conquest and invasion yourself, and that tends to get glossed over in Russian public memory. So Russians have an identity of basically committed to this Eurasian landmass, but without the ethnic component of it until recently was relatively weak. There have been Russian nationalist groups, chauvinistic groups, but until relatively recently, they were fairly weak. And Russian identity instead revolved around what a former colleague of mine, now dead, Richard Pipes, referred to as patrimonialism, which is this conception of a Russian state that revolves around a Russian leader. And in Tsarist times, when Tsars ruled Russia, that was the Tsar himself, and I say himself because it was only males. And then in Soviet times, it revolved around the leader of the Communist Party. And then for a brief while, for about 10 years or so, there was some ambiguity there. And during that time, Russian national identity was in flux. But then after Putin came to power at the end of 1999, Russian national identity became very much bound up with Putin's own personalistic rule. And so it is not what I would describe as so much as an ethnic identity. It's much more revolved around the identity revolves much more around the power of the state. And in Russia as well, that the state itself has changed over time, from being much more democratic in the 1990s, and many Russians looked on that with some concern that they wanted a strong leader. That was often cited in public opinion polls at the time. But furthermore, they were dismayed that the Soviet Union, which had been a global superpower, that suddenly Russia was reduced to a much inferior status and was no longer seen as a true rival of the United States. It was clearly seen as a secondary power compared to the United States. So one of Putin's aims in coming to office was to try to restore what he repeatedly referred to as a great power status of Russia. And for the public opinion polls have confirmed that many Russians value that as well. So if I were to single out two components of Russian national identity, they would be the personalistic power of Putin himself and the state, and then the status of a great power.
Thank you. I think we got some audience questions to get to, and we appreciate it very much.
Yes, thank you, Jewel and Jorn and Tova and Janine. Great questions today from everybody. And we have, I want to give a shout out to our students watching today. We have Victoria Kirk with the Absolute Homeschool Academy, Cherie Stiegel with homeschool students, and Cami Wanos with homeschool students. So we welcome all of our students who are watching. We also want to thank KKBV 1060 AM in Las Vegas for airing these podcasts on Monday nights at 6 p.m. Pacific. So we have a couple of audience questions who have been curious about Putin's failing health and what that would mean for change in leadership. What would you like to address that?
Okay, Putin, it's not clear that his health is failing. I know there's been a lot of speculation about it. He has had some, occasional, that is, he's had some physical appearances at which he seems to have tremoring hands or seems to have problems walking. It is very likely he had some injuries at various points. That he may have had a hip replacement. It's not known for sure. He's had other minor surgeries, but he's going to be 71 this September. I would say he, for that age, is in relatively good health. I think that quite a bit of the speculation that's gone on has been wishful thinking. I say that, I wish it were true, but I think the notion that he's going to resign because of failing health, or that he potentially would be vulnerable to being forced out of office, is mostly wishful thinking. So to the extent that he does have ailments, I would say it is much more temporary injuries rather than degenerative diseases. It's been speculated that he has Parkinson's disease. I don't think there's any truth to that. I wish it were true, but it isn't, as far as the evidence doesn't support it.
We thank you so much for being on today, and you really clarified quite a bit about the history of Russia and how that country got to where it is today. So we're past our time, and I know it's late there in Bulgaria. We don't want to keep you too late. So thank you so much, Mr. Kramer. We really appreciate having you. Thank you.
Very, very nice to speak to you. And thank you for everyone for the excellent questions you raised. So,
thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
thank you. Bye for now. It's 10
Bye.
o'clock.
Oh gosh, yeah, bedtime.
Bye.